briefing and now give the floor to Major General Alexey Bakin. You have the floor.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The Russian Center for the Reconciliation of the Opposing Sides and Refugee Migration Monitoring is focusing its main efforts in the Syrian Arab Republic on the non-military settlement of the conflict, providing comprehensive assistance to Syrian citizens to return home and to rebuild peaceful life. Through joint efforts with the Syrian government, it's been possible to achieve a substantial improvement in the situation in these areas. The statistics on the number of Syrian citizens returning home speak for themselves. Since the beginning of 2019 alone, more than 220,000 Syrian citizens have returned home, of which more than 30,000 are internally displaced persons and more than 190,000 are refugees from abroad. The majority of Syrians are returning from states that neighbor Syria. Each day, between 1,000 and 2,000 people return to Syria from Jordan and Lebanon, which demonstrates the effectiveness of all of the measures that are being taken. At the same time, alongside the positive results, there are also problems. In spite of the cessation of hostilities regime that's been established, a difficult situation is forming in the Idlib de-escalation zone. Currently, in the Idlib zone, fighters from some completely out-of-control terrorist formations are refusing to observe the ceasefire regime and are actively hindering the joint efforts of Russia and Turkey to stabilize the situation in the northwest of Syria. Since April 2019, in this zone, there has been another ratcheting up of tensions. Fighters from the terrorist organization Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, having managed to unify terrorist groups under their leadership, have stepped up attacks on the positions of government forces and shelled towns and villages. In April 2019, the Russian side recorded 169 violations of the COH regime by illegal armed formations. 41 Syrian service personnel were killed, 74 were wounded. Among the civilian population, 8 people were killed and 20 civilians received varying degrees of injury. In May 2019, 338 cases of shelling by fighters were recorded. 36 people were killed, 118 Syrian service personnel were wounded, and 24 civilians were killed and 32 wounded. In particular, on the 5th of May, 5 children and 1 woman were killed as a result of fighters from the group of Jaish al-Izza shelling the town of Skalbia with a multiple launch rocket system. On the 15th of May, with a mortar attack, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham terrorists in Nairab in Aleppo province shelled the town, killing 8 civilians, including 2 children. At the same time, at the end of April, the beginning of May, a large number of fighters from the terrorist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and its allied formations concentrated near the Syrian towns of Hama and Aleppo. Radical groups have made attempts to enter towns with a primarily Christian population, Khalbia and Mecherde in Hama province. During the attacks on government positions, the terrorists used lethal UAVs, tanks, pickup trucks with guns fixed on the back of them, and also remote-controlled bombed cars. In June, terrorist activities in Idlib de-escalation zone did not reduce in intensity. There were 302 cases of shellings and armed provocations by fighters. Syrian service personnel and civilians continue to die. On the 17th of June, as a result of a mortar shelling by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham fighters in Kudeha, Aleppo province, 11 people were killed and 15 civilians were wounded. In response to the constant provocations by terrorists, government forces have been forced to actively take defensive actions. According to objective control on all sites where hostilities were waged, the Syrian armed forces have been resisted by illegal armed formations from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. There have also been actions by Imarat Kavkaz, Haras ad-Din, the Islamic Party of Turkestan. All of these entities are acknowledged as terrorist organizations by the UN Security Council. There have been repeated shellings from multiple rocket systems by jihadists against the Russian Khmeimim airbase, which has created a real threat to the lives of Russian service personnel. The Russian aerospace forces were forced to carry out retaliatory precision strikes on firing positions and stockpiles and bases of terrorists. At the same time, this was done far from targets outside of population centers. The entire situation is being kept under control exclusively thanks to the joint coordinated actions of the Russian Federation and the Turkish Republic in accordance with the Memorandum of Stabilization of the Situation in the Idlib de-escalation zone, which was signed on the 17th of September 2018 in Sochi. In order to find ways to resolve the problem of Idlib, together with the Turkish side, we are constantly working actively to come up with new measures and mutually acceptable solutions to stabilize the situation. As part of this activity, upon the request of the Russian side, the Syrian army during May and June twice established a ceasefire regime. However, each time, a number of radical formations on the territory of the Idlib de-escalation zone continue to violate the ceasefire regime. They are shelling not only the positions of government forces and population centers, but also the observer posts of the Turkish armed forces. We continue to record attempts, the terrorists planning provocational staged activities to then blame government forces for allegedly using chemical weapons against them. Working on the ground here, we constantly see there is a one-sided treatment of the events in the Idlib de-escalation zone by Western countries who accuse Syria and Russia of escalating tensions, at the same time shutting their eyes to the atrocities of jihadists and their terrorist activities in the province. We categorically refute all of the allegations of the indiscriminate nature of strikes of government forces against targets in Idlib. We note with regret that anti-Syrian non-governmental organizations are willingly spreading false and unverified information, misleading the global community, and thereby protecting the terrorists from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. At the same time, HTS fighters and other groups, without having their activities properly assessed by the global community, are continuing to execute prisoners from among the Syrian armed forces and civilians that they have seized from the local population, just as was the case of ISIL terrorists in Palmyra and Raqqa. On the Idlib de-escalation zone, HTS fighters over the last 2 years have kidnapped, abducted at least 5,000 people, and their fate is unknown. Hundreds have been executed without trial or evidence. Taking into account the acute humanitarian situation that's formed in this area, the Syrian government, together with the Reconciliation Center and with the support of the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, has organized the necessary activities for the decent, safe, and voluntary departure of the civilian population from the Idlib de-escalation zone. In particular, on the 4th of March 2018, in Aleppo province, the Abu el-Duhur crossing point was established. It can see through 1,100 people and 50 vehicles a day. Currently, the movement of refugees through it has been suspended due to the large threat of being shelled by terrorists. Since the 27th of May 2019, an additional crossing point, Suran, has been set up that can cope with 1,000 people and 50 vehicles a day. In total, since the beginning of the operation of the crossing point, the Idlib zone has been left by more than 44,000 people, including more than 14,000 women and more than 20,000 children. According to our information, today, from 40 to 80,000 IDPs are ready to leave the de-escalation zone. For them to be received on the territory of Hama, Homs, and Deir ez-Zor provinces, the necessary amount of places in IDP centers have been set up. The Syrian government is ready to use all existing capacities to ensure the necessary conditions to allow the civilian population to return from the Idlib de-escalation zone. The Syrian government's creating of decent conditions for its citizens is something that already 15,000 Syrians have been convinced of because they've left the Rukban refugee camp. UN representatives have already also been able to see this. The Syrian authorities have ensured that they are able to speak with Syrian citizens who've returned to Homs and Hama provinces. Ladies and gentlemen, in general, the Cooperation of the guarantor countries helps to effectively counter international terrorist organizations on the territory of Syria and keep the situation in the northwest of the country under control. We note the active efforts of our Turkish colleagues to support the ceasefire regime and the demilitarized zone of Idlib. I would like to underscore that the actions of the Center for the Reconciliation of the Opposing Sides and Refugee Migration Monitoring is strictly within the framework of the implementation of the Russian-Turkish memorandum to stabilize the situation in the Idlib de-escalation zone and the agreements that were reached during the constant consultations with the Turkish and Iranian sides in the Astana format. All of the efforts of the Astana guarantors are aimed at implementing Security Council Resolution 2254 in the interests of ensuring the return of normal life to Syrian lands. At the same time, I draw your attention to the fact that any actions to halt hostilities cannot extend to the fight against terrorist organizations wherever they may be. We believe that the only way to rebuild Syria is through once and for all eliminating terrorism, including in the de-escalation zone, the return of IDPs and refugees to their homes, and also the post-conflict reconstruction of the country. Thank you for your attention.
أشكر السيد باكين على إحاطته